Hey everyone, my name is Travis and this is Dev Tips. This video that we're watching right now is called Switching from Photoshop, and it's in a series called Getting Started with Adobe XD. Big thanks to Adobe for sponsoring the series. So here's the setup. In the last video, we talked about switching from Sketch to XD, and this week we're talking about switching from Photoshop to XD. And this video is actually a little bit more relevant to me because Photoshop, for me, was my design tool of choice for over a decade. And that only changed when I joined Google and everyone was using Sketch, and so I learned Sketch and I used Sketch for a few months. And then XD was released and I just kind of was like, oh, shiny new stuff over there. And now I'm using XD. In the last video, we talked about the similarities and differences between XD and Sketch. And I feel like that transition from Sketch to XD would be a little bit more straightforward than Photoshop to XD because both of those tools were created specifically in mind for people who were designing layouts for digital interfaces. And Photoshop is an entirely different beast. It's used for a lot of different things. If you use Photoshop for layout and design now, it's likely that you've been using it for a long time. Because honestly, it's a piece of software that we as designers repurposed a long time ago to meet our needs. It was never intended to be a layout program. We should have been using InDesign or something else. But anyway, Photoshop is a great tool, especially for the demands of that time, where the websites that we would create were a lot more graphical in nature. All that is to say that if I'm making this video here and intended to help people switch from Photoshop to XD, I really need to make sure that I'm talking to the right kind of designer, a layout and digital interface designer. So let's make a really quick list of the types of things that you would be using XD for and the types of things that you would not be using XD for. XD is great for web layouts and app layouts and user flows and drawing boxes, lots of boxes, and for working fast and trying a lot of variations of your idea very quickly. That's a big strength of XD. And XD is not really great for a lot of things. There's a lot of things it's not great for. Chief among those is like graphic editing. I mean, I'm talking image editing, even simple cropping. It's not, you can mask, but cropping is not a part of it. Graphic effects, anything more than putting a simple border on something, you're gonna have a bad time. XD is not great for making a delicious and nutritious lunch. XD is not great for iterating or making a lot of versions. Oh wait. Yes, it is. That's what it's good at. But it's not good at helping you find love, because that has to come from within. And at this point, I think that we might be better served, instead of making lists about the differences between the two applications, to just create something. So let's create the same thing in both of these apps and see and notice and talk about the process and the different tools that you might use and the different, like, you know, ways that you would do it in each app. Does that sound like a fun time? First, let's design in XD. I'm going to start this project by opening a new artboard template at 360 by 640 size. The reason I do that is because 360 is a really versatile number when we're talking about grid sizing. So I'm going to make this 20 pixel column grid with 20 pixel gutters, and it's a really easy way to just have everything lined up nice and tight. I have a folder full of images, and I'm going to drag out the box that I want to contain the hero image. I just drag the image straight from my Finder onto the rectangle object that I created, and it fills that image into the background of the object. I'm going to drag out some text to be the title of the page. This is Arches National Park, a place in Utah that I went camping at recently, and it is beautiful. So I want to make a design around that right now. I'm going to use these guides to inform the size of the rectangle that I make to hold the content of the page, and put a drop shadow on there to make it stand out, and turn the background a little bit gray. Again, the guides come into play when I'm making the call to action button. This is the button that people, when they go to the campgrounds, they'll use it to book the campsite. And we have a nice little camping icon here. The next thing I want to do is look at the ratings, and I use the repeat grid to quickly pull out 5 different stars. And then I duplicate that repeat grid and make it darker to show that some of the stars are selected and highlighted. We have 3.5 stars here. I'm going to grab out some description text of the Arches National Park. I drag out a text block and fill it with that text. I'm again using those guides that I created to inform how I place that text block. Right now I want to create a carousel of images, and it's really easy to do with the repeat grid. Just repeat this block, and then if I drag a group of images onto the repeat grid, each element in the repeat grid gets filled with one of the images from the group I dragged in. Having done that, I line it back up to the grid, and it's looking good. I drag in a menu item, and then I create a scrim, which is this black gradient thing that sits on top of the image to allow the logo and menu control to kind of stand out a little bit more. I turn the whole thing into a symbol and duplicate the artboard. The reason I do this is because any changes that I make later on this layout, I want it to reflect in every version of the layout that I use. And this second artboard is going to be a state where I've dragged out the menu. So I'm going to blur that background and draw a new menu open on top of it. I really don't know what kind of links a good campground website would have, but it might be something like this. I'm going to use that same menu proportions to create the close button using the pen tool. And then why don't I use this close button to create a graphical device set between the menu items. That looks awesome. And now for the second half of this video, let's recreate the same thing in Photoshop. The first thing I did was export a flat PNG from the XD design I just did and put it right next to my new artboard in Photoshop. I noticed a big difference immediately when dragging new images into Photoshop. I'm not placing them on objects to fill, I actually have to scale and crop the images on my own. This scrim that I'm creating is very similar to what we did in XD. It's a vector object with a gradient fill. But when I place these SVG icons, I can't easily change their fill, so I'm using a color overlay style to change them white. I actually like manipulating text in Photoshop a little bit better. It's easier to do, maybe it's just because I've been doing it longer here, but I really like the way that when you create new text elements, that they retain the style of the last thing you did. XD can be pretty tiring having to reset the font every time you create a new text node. Just like XD, I'm using vector elements to drag out content containers. But this time, instead of using the grid like I had in XD, I'm just using nudges, mostly because I know exactly what I want to accomplish this time. You can see that there's a lot more fuss when I'm adjusting these stars in Photoshop. I have to manually adjust their spacing because they're not in a repeat grid like they were in XD. It's not too bad though. A quick group, a duplication, a mask, and we have 3.5 stars. You can see again that I'm using nudging a lot with these buttons and these elements because I already know the dimensions and proportions from the last time I designed this site. So I kind of have these little cheats or maybe an unfair advantage when I'm designing in Photoshop right now because I've already done the exploratory work in XD. There's no repeat grid in Photoshop, so I'm dragging out these vector objects as placeholders and then using them as masking elements for the images after I place them one by one. To get that blur effect, I duplicate the entire artboard, flatten everything, and use a Gaussian blur filter. It's not too much more work, and in the end, it all kind of looks the same. The biggest downside to this Photoshop document that I've created is that it does not scale up. I cannot export this design at 2 or 3x for Retina screens. Either way, these arches have never looked so good. That was certainly a fun time. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Dev Tips, and next week we're actually going to go into the fundamentals of XD. We're going to talk about the basics. It's not going to be a switching video. We're going to talk about how to get started with XD. What are the fundamentals? What should you know? What are the quick things that I use to make me fast and to make me excited about this application? And that's going to be next week. If you are excited about Dev Tips and what we're doing here, please join our community. We have a community at patreon.com/devtips, and the people who go there, they support the show by donating any dollar amount of their choosing, and there is a like a rewards list there. Anyway, go check it out at patreon.com/devtips. Thank you to the patrons. They make everything we do possible. And thank you also to Adobe for being an awesome partner for this series, and we'll see you next week. And until then, keep on hacking.